Very good. I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Pennington because Mark is one of these philosophers and libertarians who are addressing some of the hot issues of the day, and notably the environment question. Mark is a reader in politics and political economy at Queen Mary's University, and he has written extensively on environmental issues, but also on he's just publishing a new book, and there are flyers that are going around this room with a description of the new book, which I'm sure you will find extremely interesting to read. The environment is a hot issue, as I said, as, for instance, intellectual property rights or issues in abortion, because I find it quite surprising and very brave on the part of many libertarians to declare peremptorily that there is no such thing as global warming. For instance, people who are not meteorologists, who are not physicists, who are not astrophysicists, who are not chemists, simply declaring that there isn't something like global warming. And of course, people who are declaring this may have an agenda. Of course, some of the scientists have an ideology. And we have to denounce that ideology, we have to expose it, but it doesn't mean that they get their facts wrong. So I think that debunking facts is what we should be doing when and only when we have the knowledge in order to do it. Mark Pennington has researched the environment, and ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mark Pennington on the mirage of social justice.
Climate justice.
Sorry, climate justice. Sorry.
Never mind. I thought I was having to do something different.
No, that's right.
Never mind.
It's been a long day.
Okay, no.
Extremely interesting.
It's going to get even longer. By
contributions that I followed with too much attention. So I'm exhausted.
That's okay. Okay. Well, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to assume that there is such a thing as climate change, and that climate change, in part at least, has anthropogenic causes, that it's human-induced. At the very end of the talk, I'm going to say something about that assumption, but for the purpose of the rest of the talk, I'm going to assume that climate change is a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, a lot of the debate on climate change within that context has now moved on from concerns about what should be done about climate change to the issues surrounding the distributive effects of climate change itself, or of the policies that might need to be implemented in order to address it. According to this sort of view, irrespective of whether we go down the route of large-scale intervention to counteract climate change, or whether we go down the route of simply adapting to climate change, the consequences of these various strategies must be evaluated in terms of widely accepted principles of justice, and social justice in particular. Now, within this context, it's often argued that a just solution to the climate change issue requires that those who've been responsible for causing climate change, i.e. the existing developed nations, should compensate those countries which are going to suffer in some way from the effects of climate change. Now, needless to say, a lot of these arguments are often couched in explicitly egalitarian terms. But this is an issue which libertarians also need to address, for the simple reason that you can run a perfectly reasonable argument that climate change should be treated as a kind of tort by some people against others, that there are people who, through their actions, are going to infringe upon the person and property of other actors who are being affected by climate change. That climate change in itself, the externalities associated with this, are a clear breach of the non-interference principle which lies at the heart of libertarianism. So for that reason alone, this is an issue that libertarians need to be addressing. Now, it's the issue of whether and how we can apply widely accepted standards of justice to the climate change question that I'm going to be looking at in this presentation today. What I'm going to be arguing is that in many circumstances, many aspects of this particular topic, there are limits to how far we can push notions of justice to deal with this particular topic. In other aspects of the topic, I'm going to be arguing that notions of justice are simply inapplicable. There is no theory of justice which can account for the consequences of climate change and how we ought to address it. Now, in order to make these arguments, I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. I'll start off by sketching out what I consider to be appropriate standards for evaluating different theories of justice. And I'll run through very quickly what a libertarian account of justice is in terms of these principles. In the second part of the talk, I'll sketch out both egalitarian and libertarian arguments for redistributive or compensatory payments to be made from developed countries to the developing world. In the third section of the talk, I'm going to criticize these arguments. I'm going to be making the case that there is no basis for redistribution or compensatory payments to be made to developing countries. In making that argument, I'm still going to be claiming that a principle of justice is actually applicable to this issue. And the particular principle that I'm going to try to articulate is the libertarian notion of first possession. In the final part of the talk, however, I'm going to go through a series of issues where I think no principles of justice can be applied to deal with this question, whether they're egalitarian or libertarian. That the nature of the climate change issue simply precludes the use of the terminology of justice in this regard. Okay, so to start off, how should we think about notions of justice? Well, in political theory, there are two ways in which people think about justice. One of these ways of thinking about justice draws on what is sometimes known as ideal theory. This kind of a view starts from certain assumptions about the values that people should have and then derives a theory of justice from this particular account. It starts off from assuming that people should have certain sorts of values and then tries to flesh out what justice requires given these sorts of values. Now, there are a number of examples of theories that fall into this category. Rawlsian theories of justice are a good example. They start off from certain rock-bottom assumptions about what values people should have, i.e. some notion of equality, and then start to derive a theory of justice from these underlying assumptions. But it's not only egalitarian theories that adopt this style of reasoning. There are some libertarian accounts of justice which are based on this kind of ideal reasoning as well. People assert or assume, they start from the rock-bottom principle, that liberty is a value that everybody should respect, and then they derive something like the libertarian non-interference principle and a strict interpretation of what that requires from this sort of an understanding. Now, there's another way of thinking about questions of justice which isn't based on this ideal form of theorizing. It's what's often described as non-ideal theory. Non-ideal views of justice start off from an understanding of the way people actually are and the types of problems that they actually have to face in their lives. On this view, a principle of justice is only worthy of the name if it enables human beings, given the constraints that they face in their everyday lives, to actually live together for some form of mutual benefit. If the principle of justice that you're enunciating is simply incompatible with human coexistence, then in the non-ideal view, it should be rejected. Now, what are the kind of constraints that non-ideal theories of justice look at? Well, one of them is the notion that our theories of justice need to take into account the fact of scarcity, that human beings always have to deal with the fact that their means are limited relative to the ends that they might have. If your theory of justice basically assumes away the problem of scarcity, then on the non-ideal view, we should be rejecting that sort of a theory. Another constraint that human beings face in their daily lives is the Hayekian knowledge problem, if you like. The fact that people are limited in their cognitive capacities, and therefore they have limited capacity to understand what actually brings about particular social outcomes. If our theory of justice is based on various assumptions of omniscience, that people can know all of the factors that bring about particular distributive outcomes, then on the non-ideal view, it should be rejected, because real-world questions of justice are going to be taking place in situations where people are not fully omniscient of the factors which contribute to the outcomes that people receive. The final constraint that the non-ideal theory identifies is, if you like, the incentive problem. If our theory of justice assumes total benevolence, if it ignores the notion that economists speak about, that incentives matter, at least to some degree, then we should rule out a theory of justice which ignores these kind of incentive requirements. Now, if you follow this kind of non-ideal theorizing, there are various notions of justice which should be ruled out of court. Theories which require the abolition of private property, for example, on the non-ideal view, should be ruled out because these theories are incompatible with the recognition that scarcity is a problem that human beings have to deal with. And the primary way that human beings deal with scarcity, or the most effective way that they can deal with scarcity, is to have a system of private property and a system of competitive market exchange which generates price signals which communicate the content of that scarcity. If your theory is basically abolishing property rights, the very idea that you can have property, you're abolishing the capacity to deal with the issue of scarcity. So theories which posit the abolition of private property on this view should be ruled out. Other sorts of theories which should be ruled out will be ones associated with, say, luck egalitarianism. The claim that people should get beneficial social outcomes only if they've acted in a way which means that they deserve those particular outcomes. Theories such as Ronald Dworkin's fall into this sort of category. The problem from a non-ideal perspective with these kind of theories is that they assume it's possible for human beings to actually decipher which bits of a person's outcome are due to their own personal effort and which bits of their outcomes are due to circumstances which are beyond their control, whether it's due to their cultural inheritance, their genetic inheritance, or what have you. Given that in practice we can't work out what we've deserved and what we haven't deserved, a theory of justice which assumes that we can is just going to bring people into perpetual conflict with one another about what is or is not just. On a non-ideal theory of justice, various forms of libertarianism should be ruled out. If we have an extremely strict view of libertarianism, which claims that no interference with the private property rights of others is to be tolerated, then arguably this is simply not compatible with life as human beings living in a society together. You've got the example, I think, from David Friedman's book. If I switch on my light bulb and the rays go over into your property, am I not interfering with your property rights? If you had some kind of absolute right to stop this interference, in effect, you would close down the whole of society. So a strict interpretation of the non-interference principle on a kind of libertarian rights view, from a non-ideal perspective, ought to be rejected. Now, my understanding of the case for libertarianism is based on a kind of non-ideal theory. And I'll briefly run through what the aspects of it are. The case for private property rights on the libertarian view is that in conditions where people are likely to disagree about what is just and what is unjust, providing people with a protected domain in which they can take actions without requiring the permission of others is a way of reducing conflict. If we had to have agreement on questions of distributive justice all of the time, we'd be coming into perpetual conflict with one another. Providing people with a private sphere in which they can act without requiring agreement from others removes the necessity for that kind of conflict to be taking place. The second aspect of the non-ideal libertarian case for private property is that it internalizes externalities. If we have a system of private property rights, We can deal with the problem of scarcity because we get beyond the situation of the tragedy of the commons or the tragedy of open access. Privatizing property rights enables individuals to actually expand the social product. This is basically a version of the Lockean Proviso. Now, that proviso is often misunderstood by egalitarians. The Lockean Proviso states that you can acquire property provided that you leave enough and as good for others. Now, of course, in practice, if anybody acquires property, that literally speaking isn't true, because if you take part of the environment, you're leaving less for other people. The argument for property rights in this context is that because you're internalizing potential externalities, you're eliminating the free rider problem, people will produce in a situation where they can appropriate the benefits for themselves. So private appropriation actually expands the range of goods which are available beyond what would be the case if no one was allowed to appropriate property. Now, it's important on this view to recognize that our understanding of property rights needs to be fluid. If we're wanting to internalize externalities, we may not know what the optimum level is to internalize those externalities, how exactly the property rights should be assigned. Should they be at the level of the individual? Should they be at the level of, say, a street, or at some slightly higher communal sort of level? This isn't a question on the non-ideal view which can be set in stone. There isn't any clear-cut, absolutist answer to this sort of a question. So that's a libertarian take, if you like, on understanding property rights. Now, I want to go through, in the context of climate change, arguments that have been put forward for redistributive or compensatory payments being made to developing nations. First of all, what are the egalitarian arguments? Well, essentially, egalitarians claim that those people who have contributed most to the problem of climate change should pay for the consequences of climate change. And this is the existing developed nations. They are imposing costs on other actors who are going to be suffering the consequences of climate change. And in addition, because developed countries have already used up a large amount of carbon emissions, they are removing the potential for today's developing countries to develop in the same way. That if developing countries now have to take action to try to avoid the consequences of climate change, that is impairing their economic development potential. So that, on the egalitarian view, is the injustice of the existing order. Now, there's a certain moral view which underlies this kind of criticism. It's based on the assumption that if we have a resource which is finite, and in this case, the maximum amount of carbon emissions which could be tolerated without leading to catastrophic climate change is the finite resource. If we have a finite resource, then that resource should be distributed on the basis of the principle of strict equality. Okay? No one should be able to have a higher level of carbon emissions than anybody else. That you will be allocating these resources out on an egalitarian basis. Now, clearly, in the existing context, this isn't the case. Developed nations, on this view, have used more than their fair share of carbon emissions, and they are, as a consequence, restricting the scope for economic development in developing nations, as well as imposing the costs of climate change on those countries. Now, the view here is basically that the Lockean-style justification for property, that it expands opportunities for others rather than restricting them, simply doesn't hold. That when some countries appropriate carbon emissions for themselves, they actually reduce the potential for development in other parts of the world. That's basically the ethical underpinning of this sort of an argument. Now, what is the libertarian argument in this context? Well, there's a libertarian argument which can be made in favour of compensating developing countries. There are some economists who make the argument that it simply isn't worth doing anything about climate change because the costs that would be imposed on developed nations from trying to address the problem would be so great that they would outweigh the costs which are going to be imposed on developing countries. Okay, there may be a few more floods in some parts of the world, the climate may change to a degree in some parts of the world, but overall, the costs of climate change would not be great enough to justify the costs that will be imposed on developed countries from trying to address it. Now, of course, this is classic utilitarian sort of reasoning that most libertarians would want to question. In a situation where people's persons or property could be threatened by climate change because of flooding or hurricanes or whatever it may be, the point is those people are being damaged by the acts of other people. Whether or not the overall social benefit, i.e. the benefit to existing developed nations, outweighs these costs to developing countries is irrelevant. We wouldn't tolerate that kind of utilitarian calculation on libertarian grounds in many other areas of life. People will be wanting to assert the primacy of individual rights. So on the libertarian view, why should we engage in these kind of utilitarian calculations to avoid doing something about climate change in this particular context? The libertarian solution would be, on this kind of a view, that developing nations should be able to apply for some kind of injunctive relief against the developed world. They should be able to require that the developed countries stop emitting carbon emissions. And then when that injunctive relief has been provided, they can then be in a position to decide whether or not they will be willing to allow developed nations to emit more carbon emissions in exchange for some kind of compensation. But it will be their decision as property holders whether or not that should go ahead, whether that transaction could go ahead, not the result of some grand utilitarian calculation made by people at the UN or whatever. That will be the libertarian argument in this context. Now, I think both of these theories, the egalitarian theory and the libertarian theory, as I've just enunciated it, should be rejected in the case of climate change. And I want to explain now my reasons for doing so. Okay, the egalitarian approach is premised on the notion that the equal use of what is described as ecological space is the only morally justified resource allocation, because it assumes that the Lockean Proviso argument does not work in the context of climate change. Now, this is the view which I think from, if you like, a practically informed libertarian perspective should be rejected. Today's developing countries are not the hapless victims of the carbon emissions which are the product of the developed nations. The potential for development today in developing countries and for carbon-free development in developing countries hasn't been reduced by the activities of existing developed countries. It has actually been increased. Today's developed nations, developing countries rather, have got the possibility to have higher levels of industrial output for lower levels of carbon emissions, precisely because the developed world has already gone through a process of dirty growth. The victims, if you like, were the first generations of people who experienced the Industrial Revolution. They were the people who suffered the very high levels of pollution, which has now made possible the prospect of development in other parts of the world for a far lesser degree of ecological damage. It is not the case that developing countries are simply the victims in this case. There are many benefits that they can reap from the fact that other countries have actually developed first. So the Lockean Proviso in this case, the argument for invoking the Lockean Proviso, does apply. The fact that some countries have used more carbon emissions at one point opens up the prospect for development for other countries which requires less carbon emissions. Now, what matters about this view and about this particular point is that even in principle, strict equality in the use of ecological space would not be a desirable principle to adopt. Why? Because any process of technological change is always one in which the first technologies are always extremely high cost and can only be applied to a few people, whereas gradually over time the cost of technology falls and the benefits can then become available to a wider number of people. Now, this applies in the case of carbon emissions. low carbon industrialization would not have been a practical possibility. The possibility today for having solar power, wind power, all these other sorts of things only exists because there has been a pre-existing process of industrialization which has used high levels of carbon. Now, in this situation, somebody has to go first. Somebody has to be the dirty industrializer in order for somebody else to subsequently become a clean industrializer. The point is, in terms of a theory of justice, that there are no principles of justice which can be used to determine who should go first in this evolutionary chain. Who should be the countries that have the dirty industrialization as opposed to the cleaner industrialization? Any country today which industrializes on a clean basis will be parasitic on the dirty technologies which have been used by existing societies. So on this view, the view that I'm expressing, a non-ideal view, the principle of the equal allocation of ecological space should be rejected. Okay, what about the libertarian theory? Okay, on this view, on the libertarian view, developing countries, rather, should be able to apply for injunctive relief against the developed world. They should be able to demand, in effect, that carbon emissions are stopped because those emissions are causing damage to persons and property of people in developing parts of the world. Once that injunctive relief has been issued, then these countries will be in a position, if they wish, to demand compensation in exchange for the carbon emissions continuing. What is wrong with this logic? Well, first of all, the case for injunctive relief, stopping emission of carbon dioxide by today's developed nations, doesn't get off the ground because it falls foul of the basic libertarian common law principle that people who are claiming injunctive relief must have clean hands. Okay, the people who are wanting to impose these injunctions mustn't be about to commit the very same acts themselves. Now, of course, developing countries want to develop, so they're about to engage in a process which would mean that they are basically abandoning the case for injunctive relief. They're about to become polluters themselves. The issue isn't that they don't want to become polluters. The whole debate, especially from the egalitarian perspective, is basically a complaint that developing countries haven't got there first. That's really what this argument comes down to. But they're not rejecting the argument for development as such. They want to develop. So on those grounds, on these common law principles, there is no case for developing countries to apply for injunctive relief. Nonetheless, you could still argue that they are due compensation for past harms which have been committed by today's developed countries. The carbon emissions that have taken place in the past could still be imposing costs on the developing world today. This argument doesn't work either, though, for the same reason that I argued that we should reject the egalitarian case. Why? Because, yes, it's true that some costs may be imposed on developing countries, but before you can make arguments for compensation, we also have to take into account on the balance sheet the uncompensated benefits that developing countries have received from the developed world. The fact that they've got access to cleaner technology, the fact that they may have higher levels of economic growth because of the industrialization that's already taken place somewhere else in this context. Someone would have to factor in that part of the balance sheet, the uncompensated benefits from climate change, as well as taking into account the uncompensated costs of climate change. Now, I put it to you, and again, bearing in mind that I'm working within the context of a non-ideal theory here, that it's simply impossible to work out whether or not the costs outweigh the benefits or vice versa in this situation. It simply isn't a workable principle of justice to apply in this context. Okay, final part of my talk. It seems to me, looking at the cases that I've just been speaking about, that the only viable principle of justice which could be invoked would be something like a sort of libertarian first possession rule. There isn't any principle of justice which we can use to decide that who goes first in the process of industrial development. but the idea that someone should go first is at least desirable. This argument doesn't work, however, for a final set of climate change problems. What about the possibility of there being developing countries, or poor countries, put it that way instead of developing countries, poor countries who do not want to develop economically? What about countries that value a subsistence lifestyle, maybe some remote tribe existing somewhere, doesn't want industrial development, but nonetheless is facing the consequence of disruption to their lifestyle as a consequence of climate change, which has been brought about by the actions of people in other parts of the world? Now, in this case, it seems to me there is no principle of justice which can be invoked successfully. The problem is that it's impossible to allocate property rights to the global atmosphere in a way which satisfies the Lockean Proviso. If we were to allocate property rights to today's developed countries, it will be a winner-take-all scenario for them. Okay? They could impose costs on these countries that don't want to have economic development. If, on the other hand, the property rights were to be awarded to the developing countries, the countries that don't want development in this context, then they would have the winner-take-all scenario. In effect, they could close down the rest of the global economy by invoking their property rights. Now, in this situation, where we can't invoke first possession even, because it's not going to be for mutual benefit, first possession in this scenario is going to result in a winner-take-all scenario. There is no principle of justice, in my view, which can be evoked satisfactorily to actually resolve the question. There is no way, in terms of any theory of justice, we can decide who gets these property rights. The sad fact of the matter is that this issue won't be determined according to principles of justice. It will be determined by who is the most powerful set of communities in the international order. And like it or not, that means the existing developed nations are going to be taking these decisions, whether or not they conform to principles of justice or otherwise. Final point to conclude. The elephant in the room throughout all of this discussion, of course, is the issue of whether or not climate change is actually happening and whether or not it's human-induced if it is. My own view on that echoes the one that Christian enunciated. I think libertarians, even if, and I'm personally very sceptical of a lot of the scientific consensus on this issue, even if we are sceptical about these issues, libertarians have got to take the climate change issue more seriously than they previously have done. And I hope in my talk today I've given you some illustrations of how that argument may proceed. Thank you very much.
Superb. A powerful brain in action. So, well, as you can see, a few questions will start from right and go to the left. So, first I saw Esther, and then Ms. Benjamin. Esther. That isn't a mic.
I know we are in the separate field of justice, and the government knows what it is. But from the legal point of view, there used to be a difference when you commit a crime before it was introduced into law that it is a crime, and after that, or even between a crime that you committed without knowing that it's actually bad for anyone else, compared to what was committed after you were made aware that I'm talking about emissions. So how do you accomplish this?
Okay, if you don't mind, we'll take, because we are limited by time.
Okay, no problem.
Constraints are in the other room. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then maybe another round, 2 or 3 questions, and we stop there.
I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. Also on a sort of legal point, you made this really clever argument about equity favours those with clean hands and so on. But obviously that's a maxim of English law, and this is an international issue, and most of it is probably civil law anyway. Is that not really a bit of a quibble?
Just a quick point. First of all, I think it's really good that you're framing this question in terms of saying we have to assume that AGW might actually be occurring rather trouble with a lot of the AGW skeptics out there is that I was kind of worried that they deep down they actually aren't skeptics at all. They know there isn't threat, but they're desperate to pretend there isn't, so they don't have to jump the free market, if you see what I mean. So I think it's very important that we don't have any preconceptions about whether there is a problem or not.
Yeah.
Simple question. Free market environmentalism is an interesting subset of our point of view. What do you make of things like attempts to create sort of like artificial markets like carbon trading or whatever? Because there have been some people like Nigel Lawson, who've argued that a lot of these artificially created markets, which are in fact a recipe for massive amounts of corruption.
Okay, well, I'll take that one first. I'm very sceptical of them because, first of all, they're not free markets. I mean, because the level of carbon emissions is being centrally determined. What carbon trading is a combination of central planning in terms of deciding how much carbon you're going to emit, and then you have a market element where you have trading with the various firms who've got the particular quotas. Yes, it's subject to rent seeking in terms of how those quotas are allocated and the process of actually framing the regulations through which the markets operate. I think someone who's defending the argument for those would say, given that there's a problem, given that the alternative is doing nothing, you could make a very loose kind of cost-benefit case for it's better to do something than to do nothing. I think you can equally make, quite plausibly, a libertarian view, which would be to say that for these kind of schemes to work, you have to create, in effect, a global state. You know, it's not going to be any good unless all countries are required, in some sense, to be subscribing to these schemes. Now, a global state, for it to work effectively, is going to have to monitor whether or not these kind of rules are actually being adhered to. Given that the European Union can't even monitor whether its own budget is being adhered to properly, the idea that we could trust some kind of global structure to do this seems to me absolutely absurd. It simply isn't worth the cost, the dangers of creating a global leviathan which will be totally unaccountable to citizens. I think unless you have really cataclysmic views on what climate change is likely to result in, it isn't worth going down that path of establishing some kind of global state. We'd be better just adapting to climate change rather than going down that kind of a route. The question about clean hands, isn't it just a quibble? I don't think it is. I mean, I was using the clean hands case within the context of what I was describing as a non-ideal theory. Now, if you like, common law arguments in general are the ultimate example of a non-ideal theory. So my talk is sort of an illustration of why that kind of theoretical view of the world, that we start from assuming imperfection and then work from there, is the best way of dealing with the issue, rather than assuming that all problems can be sorted out through some kind of rationalistic blueprint. That's the kind of line of thinking that I'm actually trying to reject. It's a kind of theoretical point that I'm making, but I don't see any reason why in practice somebody can't invoke that argument when people make these sorts of claims. Then the other point, which was about people not knowing about the effects of climate change, yes, I think that's a perfectly valid point. You can't hold people accountable initially, in the sense, when they were totally unaware. Certainly not people who are dead. But given that we now know about these consequences, developed countries can't just walk away and say, well, okay, well, people in the past didn't know about it. We know about it now, and therefore it's not justified as taking very draconian measures necessarily. I don't think those measures are justified, but we need a theory of why they're not justified, and that's what I was trying to set forward.
Very short questions, and
I'd like to defend not the happy technologically conservative society of Bongo Land as a whole, but the individual technological conservatives of Bongo Land who do have clean hands and who have had harms imposed upon them by our disgusting smoke, etc. Now, if we cannot defend them against these torts, then the whole of tort law, practice, theory, and non-interference within our societies falls apart. There are many other gaps in your superbly interesting talk, which I hope to follow up later, but that, I think, is an important one.
Okay, can I deal with that straight away?
That's right.
Okay, what I was saying is, absolutely, there's a libertarian case for saying that the developed world today, or anybody who wants to develop economically, is imposing costs on people who don't want to develop. I don't think there are many such people, actually, but in principle, at least, we could recognize that they exist. What I'm claiming is that in order for the tort to be invoked, we have to have an account of who has the property rights in the first place. Okay? Who has those property rights? Do they reside with the people who don't want the pollution, or do they reside with the polluters? Now, I'm saying there's no principle of justice to determine who should have those property rights. If you give a property right to a global atmosphere free from CO2 emissions to people who don't want development, you're giving them an absolute right to close down the whole global economy. If, on the other hand, you were to give it to the polluters, you are giving them the right to unlimited pollution. I'm claiming that there's no principle of justice to determine who should have that right. We can't invoke first possession, which normally benefits everybody, because in this case it's a winner-take-all scenario, not a situation which can be converted into one of mutually beneficial exchange.
It's because your argument is based on social assumptions.
Ben, sorry, Ben.
No.
One line.
Aside.
If it is true that the planet is getting warmer, and if it is true that humans contribute to that, not only do I think the last thing we should want is to have a global government trying to stop it and spending billions to do it, I think we can make a good case to actually encourage human activity to promote global warming, because we've invented the air conditioner. And most people live in areas that get very cold in the winter because our ancestors didn't have air conditioners. Now that we've invented air conditioners, it would be quite nice if the places where most people live are somewhat too warm in the summer, in which case we put the air conditioner on, and somewhat too cold in the winter. People don't have to move to the suburbs. Do you agree with me?
No.
Why not?
I'm very open to technological solutions to climate change, absolutely. I mean, that would be the argument, the reason I favour adaptation. I think that if you impose massive regulations on the global economy now, you reduce the capacity for it to generate the technological innovations which could help us to deal with climate change, whether it's natural or human-induced. So at that level, I'm with you. However, to say that we can just go ahead without thinking about it on the grounds that one day we could sort of create some massive global air conditioning system, I think is stretching the limits of credulity, if you don't mind me saying so.
I think a lot of the arguments are looking at things in the wrong direction, really. If you take, say, the reparation arguments in the United States, the bizarre idea of giving blacks reparations for slavery, which happened several generations ago, surely for the last, particularly the last 50 years, the trillions that we in the West have given the third world, the trillions that we've given the third world, preemptively, I suppose, in comparison to the money we're talking about, the reparations for quote-unquote global warming, surely we've given them the money already. Now, how they've chosen to spend it is another thing.
No, I couldn't agree more with you about that. I mean, I'm totally opposed to international development aid. In fact, I think you could even make the argument that, if anything, I don't believe this, but if anything, you could say that we ought to pay compensation for the fact that we've given developing countries development aid, which has impoverished them. That would be a coherent view, but...
We should sue us.
They could give us the aid. That was us.
Yeah.
What would be your view in the event that the consequences of global warming turn out to be positive? Would you then support developing countries paying back to us?
Well, that's the point that I'm saying that you simply can't make that kind of cost-benefit calculation. I don't think you can work out whether the benefits outweigh the costs either way. And that was in the context where countries do actually want to develop. I think all you can do is invoke something like a first possession rule. The fact that whoever industrialized first, well, they've got the right. You know, they can't have some kind of relief being imposed against them. But there isn't any principle that you can invoke as such as to who should go first, other than who happens to have done it. That was the argument that I was making there. I don't believe you can engage in these kind of cost-benefit analyses of whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs or not. Because we've no way of knowing.
It is a fascinating subject, and I'm very pleased that we had Mark Pennington to guide us in a discussion there. I would have liked to get more questions, and I apologize if I rushed these last questions, but I've been told repeatedly that we are asked to join the bar and start another type of conversation altogether. I would like to remind everybody that there are still books in, I think it's Lady Violet room, and we would like you to take them away so that we don't need to repack them and get them back to wherever they come from. And I would like to thank you all for having attended this conference. I think it's, in my opinion, it's the best I've attended since I've been in the Libertarian Alliance. And thank you for making it happening. And join me in thanking Mark Pennington for a brilliant talk. Thank you very much.